What's up, Craig? What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 20th of December 2023 episode of Roundup, which is a container that we hold um, every Mercury Day or Sunlight of Mercury Day at roughly 5 p.m. Sofia time, which I believe is, what time is it where you are, Hoda?
9:13 a.m.
Okay, so 9 a.m. in like the central time zone of the United States of America,
Mhm.
10 a.m. in the eastern time zone of the United States of America, and 17 plus 6 is 11 p.m. in Perth, Australia, 2 a.m. in Sydney, Australia, and all kinds of different times across the world. And yeah, Roundup is a container which we use to have conversations, usually about what's been happening in the Discord server, which we call the Broom, in the past week. Um, However, right now, I'd have to say that most present in my mind is sort of like what's happening outside of the Broom. um, I'm curious how the field is feeling for y'all.
Mm. It feels pretty, to me, from my perspective, the field feels pretty, um, like on the surface, it looks like it's business as usual for the collective, and
Mm.
I'm including myself in
Mhm.
that. Um, I think folks are just kind of like focused on the holidays and like preparing themselves for whatever that might bring for them. But then there's this like other layer that I've been tuning into where it feels like the cosmos is like preparing the collective on Earth for the winter solstice.
Mhm.
And it feels like, for at the risk of sounding like a new age activation spiritualist, it does sound like it does feel like it's like upgrade season, and that like I can feel like these like waves of energy or timelines passing through the collective. And yeah, they're pretty intense.
Y'all heard it from Intrepid Bodies. Make sure you get plenty of rest and lots of water. Um, I'm curious. I'm curious to hear. Well, I definitely want to hear about what you feel um, is on offer for the collective. Julie says, "We're ascending."
That we are. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it kind of, I was tweeting, or I was on Threads a little bit yesterday writing about it, and I was like, it feels like um what's on order is like it's like application season. So in other words, like a lot of the time that people have spent like practicing or cultivating their spiritual gifts, for lack of better words, um I feel like a lot of, at least my spiritual core is like, okay, now apply this, apply what you've learned,
Mm.
put it into action, see if it can kind of impact you at where you stand. um so yeah, I'm curious how the atmosphere feels to other people as well.
Hmm. It feels right to me. When you said it, I feel like my chest kind of like expanded, sort of
um
energetically. Um,
that's
yeah, I'm
nice to
glad that
hear.
you named the solstice. Yeah. Um, I'm glad that you named the solstice. I feel like that's a huge kind of energetic influence. Like basically the way I think about it is like Earth is like tilting to its extreme position with regard to like the sun. and well, not tilting really, because it's more about like the arc of like the way that Earth floats around in a solar plane, and not so much about the precession of the axis. But yeah, I feel like winter solstice is a thing. I feel like what's happening in the Levant is still kind of a thing, but I feel like it's gotten quieter. And of course, like, it's very difficult for me to completely separate the material from the immaterial. But, you know, if people have been following like solar weather, wherever you follow that, you're probably aware that there's a massive coronal hole, which is basically a big blob in the sun, has been like pointing towards Earth for the last like week or so, maybe a little bit longer. And yeah, I guess like I'll hold space to hear like what you think that means in terms of like our experience on Earth, materially and immaterially.
Well, I've been reading a little bit on the coronal mass ejection, and
Mm,
yeah, I think it's been about a week. You're right with that. And it feels like, I guess, on a material level, um, it's hard not to see how the sun, as a like celestial body or a luminary, as folks call it, like it's hard to not see how it affects like the material. And so, of course, I was reading a little bit about how like there's the potential risk of for like electricity and like radio
mm,
blackouts, which I think also are being tracked pretty substantially.
mm,
And I also feel like immaterially, like the first place that I was directed to is like the crown chakra.
mm,
Um, and yeah, it's, I feel like for me, I'm still probably like mapping it. But yes, I also have heard and read, Nobu in the chat is mentioning the Carrington event. Some pretty like reputable sources talking about how this coronal mass ejection likens the one that was expelled from the sun during the Carrington event. And so a lot of astrologers and astronomers are kind of like tracking it
mm.
and likening
That's
it
nice.
to that event. Yeah.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's volcanoes erupting in Iceland, apparently. Yeah, I'm like really curious um, to the extent to which people connect what's happening with, yeah, like coronal mass ejections in the sun with astrology and with tectonic activity, and also with like, all of the systems that we're pretty dependent upon for power and communications. I don't feel like, I mean, I was very encouraged to hear that you've seen astrologers and astronomers connecting to it. I think some of my closest spiritual astrology friends are sort of like turning onto it just now. Um,
Nice.
ooh, oh, this says Pam Gregory just made a video on geomagnetics. That's cool. Um, but yeah, I guess like what I feel called to say now is like I kind of think of the solar plane as like the skin of a drum, but it's made out of like plasma. And
Mm.
I don't know how many people are familiar with how plasma works. I'm not even sure how familiar I am with how plasma works, but I kind of tend to think of like an electrical wire as sort of like the first order of transmission, right? So the way that power tends to transmit through a circuit is through electrons bumping into each other, which all have energy and they pass that energy onto one another. And then the electrons move a little bit, they actually move fairly slowly. But then, like, plasma is like the second order of um, a conductor, where it's like the actual, if you imagine the wire is also moving as well as um, all of the material in that wire also communicating with one another. So, some people, like when there is a coronal mass ejection, they'll talk about when the mass is going to arrive, whether it's going to hit Earth or whether it's going to bounce off of Earth's geomagnetic shield. And I would argue that whether or not it actually arrives at Earth, there is probably some change in what is being communicated through the sounding of that skin of that drum, which we perceive basically instantly at the speed of light. Um, and then the front of that mass, like whether or not it hits Earth, also changes the very fabric, right? So it's like, I guess another way of thinking about it is like the solar plane and the ether, which consists the solar plane, is like a screen. And then the stuff that's being projected upon it by the sun, by all of the different wanderers, like the planets, the stars, etc. And then the actual screen itself is like changing shape when the sun emits coronal mass.
Mm.
So yeah, I would say, like if you're looking at reports and say like, oh, the coronal mass is going to arrive at Earth in the next 3 days, I would say as soon as we see it, and like I would say even before most people are aware that a coronal mass is ejected, there is some change to the ether, and then that ether tends to cause resonance within Earth's core. And then the resonance in Earth's core tends to lead to tectonic activity like volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. And of course,
Mm.
we're protected by the field of the moon, the lunar plane, but there's only so much protection. I'd say it's more like a filter. Um, and then so, yeah, I feel like what I tend to notice is like people who aren't filtered or shielded from those types of changes tend to have things resonating in their own fields. There's, of course, like the Schumann resonances, which tend to change downstream of changes to the ether in the solar plane. And, people's brain waves are more or less like entrained to Schumann resonances, which are like the resonant frequencies of the ionosphere, I believe it is, of Earth.
Yep.
And that tends to have effects on people's cognition. And then I feel, yeah, like the changes in the ether, like I think if you believe in astrology, then perhaps like a lot of people who believe in astrology or like they follow astrology don't necessarily think about like the core metaphysics of it. But I would say that what we are assigning meaning to is fluctuations in the ether, which appear due to the vibrational influence of planets and stars and asteroids and so on. And as I've talked about in Why Am I Like This mini plug, um, those fluctuations end up having effects on our fields. And yeah, like the fabric of the ether and our position in that fabric of ether ends up determining what people call like their nativity or their natal astrology. Um, so yeah, like what I tend to notice is like, yeah, like people get dysregulated, and then I would say the behavioral patterns or thought form complexes, which are attached to rupture in their fields, which tends to resonate more loudly when there are disturbances in the solar plane, that tends to get kicked up. So people kind of like act out of trauma and conditioning. But I would call like more availability. Like as an exorcist, I would say like their trauma is more available to me. um, snack time. Um, but digestion is work. Um, I think I talk about like East Asian medicine, and we talk about digestion quite a bit in the broom, which may or may not be called the pot soon. We talk about like how chewing is a form of digestion, like cooking is a form of digestion, and I'd say chewing and cooking are ways which are designed to lessen the load on our metabolisms or our bodies when it comes to turning the genetic material of other life forms into fuel for our life form. So I think that explains possibly like how I'd say people who maybe like exorcists without knowing it, or you could say like light workers or spirit workers or whatever, tend to feel these things a lot because either they're being directly affected by changes in the ether and the ionosphere, um, or they're subconsciously harmonizing what's showing up in other people's fields in response to changes in the ionosphere and the etheric plane. Um, and then I'd say like most people don't necessarily feel it, like they might just behave in ways which they perceive as being more erratic. Or, like a lot of people have like really well honed coping patterns, which, put them in states which are considered more normalized in our consensus reality matrix. Um, so, like, they might even feel like they're more normal, or like more productive, or they adhere more towards the expectations of the people around them and society as a whole. Hoda says, would you say they sense it in advance? I would say some people sense it in advance. I mean, I mean, you and I and a few other people in the room, I would say, do things and then things happen in the sun.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not even just like sensing it. I would say that a lot of us tend to like be part of the orchestration, which leads to the sun ejecting coronal mass. And I guess like I'll keep on talking a little bit more, even though I don't love the sound of my own voice or my propensity for using it. But I'll say that for me, yeah, I think it's probably not unfair to liken the sun to like the powerhouse of a cell, like the mitochondrial core. And I would say that like when the cell needs to like do things or change the way it's transacting with other cells or solar systems in the body of Nut or the One, I would say that usually takes the form of either changes in what Earth's um, experiencing through like the skin of the drum of the sun, or yeah, coronal mass ejections. Yeah, and sometimes if you're in the broom or maybe what might be called the pot soon, you'll hear people talking about throwing souls into the sun, and for me, it's very literal. Um, just like in our bodies, like some cells have to die in order to make room for new cells or new expressions of genetic material. I'd say like on an intracellular level, the same thing applies because, as people like to say, as above, so below, or as I was talking with ever happening on threads, I think the more literal translation is something like, I'm trying to figure out exactly what he said. It was basically like the above is like and made of the below, which is like and made of the above. So I think everything that we're saying with regard to like the solar system as a cell also applies to subsystems of the solar system. And they're all connected via networks of spiritual energy or intelligence from my perspective.
How do you feel like this relates to the conversation that we're having?
Could you say that again, Anna? I think it cut out a little bit.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you say, "Can you hear me?" You said, "How does this relate to something like the question I posed earlier?"
I was asking, how do we feel like this relates to the conversation that we were having? Is it-
Um, I mean, for context, I feel like the conversation, and just to clarify, the conversation we're having relates to um, doing work or like making changes in the material realm.
Yeah, I was thinking about like what we were talking about with pain and suffering.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, so I guess like we were having conversations about um, the situation in the Levant and Pyrrhic victories. I guess like victories which are mostly symbolic. Um, and I think like one of the sub conversations was about um, like acting in order to make sure that victories are not merely symbolic. And that led to a conversation about the difference between pain and suffering and what might move people to act in the material realm versus act symbolically or act to produce symbols. Um,
Mhm.
and of course, like symbols are material, but of course, I think it's necessary to recognize the difference between, say, like material conditions and symbolic material conditions in order not to spiritually bypass the fact that, yeah, like whether or not an Instagram account called Jewish Voices for Peace has more followers than the state of Israel um, is like sufficient, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think like to connect, like, I think like this relates to what Hoda was saying about like, you know, upgrades, like what new age spiritualists tend to call like upgrades or like ascension blueprints. Is that accurate for you, Hoda?
I'd say yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to say more?
Um, well, yeah, I feel similar to like what you were saying about how it's hard for me to look at the cosmic scope of things and not relate it to like material circumstances. And
Mm,
so if we're kind of sitting in this context where like the luminaries, other wanderers are like actually impacting the like cellular makeup of our physical bodies, um,
mm,
it's really easy then for me to like be placed into that like intercellular context and look at humanity as like part of this greater cell or this greater orchestration, which we talk about a lot in the room. So I'm like not going to spend too much time on that. But I'd say like side and so changes in the social strata and the veils that kind of have kept um the social, I don't know what word I want to say, I guess things that have just kept like the social stratosphere, um the way that it's been working are kind of not only just falling away to sound like auspicious and mysterious, but I feel to me it directly relates to how these like the physics of how things in the cosmos impact um, the way that humans think and the way that humans are empowered to like give their awareness to certain things or certain media cycles. And I think for me it's getting easier to see, so like to bring it deeper into the context that we're talking about regarding pain and suffering, I think it's easier to see things like, and I'll just say like performative activism or like symbolic activism that counts these like pyrrhic victories as like total wins. um but then it's contradictory because people's material circumstances don't change when these like symbolic victories happen. And it actually reminds me of a huge like social conversation that was happening between like 2012 and 2000, I'd say like 18, where people were talking about how stuff like representation, which was a huge thing in the United States, not only just in entertainment but in media cycles. um, People were talking about how like representation really matters and like how we should have more diverse voices in the newsroom and in all these different institutional spaces. But then shortly after that, I feel like people were like realizing, and I feel like even now people are sitting with the wisdom that's come from humans just having taken so much time and effort and resources and money to have these like symbolic victories over one another. But I think now people are starting to see that like things like representation and like a gathering of voices doesn't really necessarily um change anything for people personally. And I think that for me that's been huge because of like just like my time on social media, just like on the web, but also like partnering with other people. um I have also realized that um, some of the people or the voices or the platforms that say they're for liberation or that they're for the crumbling of the system as it is are usually, this is just my experience, and I would love to know if it's functioned this way for y'all. That I've realized that a lot of people are like they're just more for. It just seems like society's like polarized between like real change, for lack of better words, in the context that I'm talking about, and performative change. And I think for me, that's important to acknowledge when differentiating between pain and suffering or speaking to that spectrum of human experience, because I don't know if you can actually, or if one can actually connect to what it is that people need or want to be different if the onus of activism is like who can say the best sound quip, or like how can we publish the most like suffering populace to get more likes and clicks and engagement because it ensures that a certain publication gets money in their pocket, let's say. So I feel like I'm bringing a couple of things into the room, but I would just, yeah, I'm curious if you guys have had that same experience. I guess what I'm narrating is like an overall disenchantment with the like news cycle, and also um, it feels like I'm just kind of like taking a jab at journalists, but I feel like it's a little bit bigger than that. And I also feel like explaining why I'm disenchanted does more than just saying I'm disenchanted, because it doesn't mean, I think for me personally, like a lot of people have like just kind of given up. And personally, that's not where I'm at. So that's why I wanted to give some context for like why I'm disenchanted. Because I actually think it's a strategy that no longer works. But I'd be curious to know what y'all think.
Yeah, I'd say like what you were reminding of me of reminds me of like every time I've been to Target in the last like 3 years. And it's
Mm,
like, you have like more people of like, previously marginalized identities wearing like rainbow paraphernalia. And I can see like how that is like a step forward for marginalized identities, people who are commonly identified as parts of groups which are commonly marginalized.
right, right.
But it's like, what are they wearing, right? Like, who's making the clothes that they're wearing, apart from like children in third world countries, and like who's benefiting the most from the markup on those clothes? It's like the same people, right? And yeah, like maybe we have like more people who look like that, like in positions and influential media, but like what are they talking about? I think you spoke to this, where it's like I would say that yes, I would say that often they're representing the perspectives of groups of people who are commonly marginalized. I'm kind of like stumbling over like the politically correct words to use, but are the perspectives that they're sharing advancing,
Mm,
um I would say, efforts to reclaim space and time
mm,
for those people, you know, versus just like, it's like if you have a wall and that wall is separating people from what, let's say, belongs to them fairly, and then you're just projecting different images on that wall, you're not
mhm,
really reclaiming space and time.
right.
You're just
Right.
like changing the configuration of the pixels of establishment, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I would say, yeah, often like the perspectives which are articulated, the energy with which those perspectives are articulated tend to deepen polarity and I would say deepen the obstruction to unity, which might actually result in action which reclaims space and time. So it's more evenly distributed so that people can do what they want with space and their own time. Um, and we can talk about whether like space can be owned, but I would say like the space that my body moves through in every moment is my space. And I would say that what I'm able to do in that space as time passes is not free of coercion. I would say like the percentage by which it's free of coercion is fairly low. And when I talk about reclaiming space and time, I'm saying fundamentally that I think people reclaiming space and time would look like being less coerced into doing or not doing what they're doing in their bodies in each moment.
Mache. It's almost as if there's like a move in what you were saying from like radicalizing oneself to radicalizing one's relationship to reality. And I feel like for me, I'm always looking at things from the perspective of like what's the best use of space and what's the best use of time. Often, and it feels like that, where a lot of revolutionary tactics were specific for a specific time period. And I feel like we're in a totally different arena with so many different influxes of information and sensory information that make it to people's purview, whether they're at a Target, whether they're at work. There's so many different, I'll call them invitations, but that's just me being nice. Um, to siphon people's awareness. And I um, have felt for a couple years like in the closet because I'm like, um, everything about my identity is the way that it's perceived is radical at its base level. And at the same time, I've also felt like the depths of what I really want people to start like paying attention to, or at least the people in my circle, is yeah, like how these different invitations, whether it's from media or other people or conflicts to like siphon um, one's awareness. I feel like I would really love it if people could figure out what they would want to spend their time doing and what they would want to give space to in their day to day lives. And I feel like it sounds simple, but I feel like, yeah, it's radical because it actually takes it's work. It's fucking work, to say the least. People are always like, change your perspective as if that's an easy thing. And I don't think that because it's not easy, it's not worth doing. But I think mostly because of the work that it takes. So what it would take for people to divorce themselves from the way things are already is a bit of a leap. But I also am like, if the sun is fucking opening up a black hole inside of itself, then like for me personally, I'm like, that's all the motivation I need. But I know it's not the same for everyone.
Yeah, I'm trying to organize like what's kind of coming through my channel right now. And, I know like we're all channeling, holding this container, making offerings to this container right now. But yeah, I think you spoke really well about like, okay, what would you do with your time? And I think the same applies to space, right? Like if we're going to talk about the Levant, or we're going to talk about Ukraine, or we're going to talk about Burma, or we're going to talk about like immigration crises, like the Syrian refugee crisis, um, immigration into the U.S., whether or not you think it's a crisis or whether you want to cancel me for even invoking the crisis word when it comes to immigration in the US, we're also talking about like what space is my body allowed to occupy.
mm,
And I think like, what you do with your time is difficult to separate from space because like some people might want to go to the beach, but I think there's like that layer of like, okay, what are you allowed to do? Um,
yes.
I think there's a layer of like what you feel coerced to do. Like I would say,
Mm,
like most people might say they want to go to work so they can earn money, but that's predicated upon an archetypal system where we feel like we need to provide value in order to benefit from the value that society produces, which I think is at least in some circles highly contested and probably not in enough circles. But then I think like below the layer of like, okay, what do we need to do within the belief system we live in? And then sort of like, you know, I'd say like on a slightly lower level, like what are we allowed to do or where are we allowed to be? Where are
mm,
we allowed to spend time in our bodies? There's also this layer of like, what do our preferences make us want to do?
mm,
And then I'd say like way, 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 way below, like layers and layers of preferences, which are informed by a ton of different things. But I'd say principally the trauma and conditioning of our Earth ancestors.
mm,
There's like, what would we be doing if we were still part of the Earth? Like if we still felt irrevocably connected to the Earth and the consciousness of the Earth and the desires of the Earth in its cultivation of itself.
mm,
And I think when I made this transmission, and I think it was T215 about reclaiming space and time, I feel like this was part of what was being offered is the ability to perceive how these layers interact and obstruct, I would
mm,
say, truly being indigenous people, which I define as being connected to the earth consciousness, and also like being offered tools for articulating how these layers interact and come to bear upon our preferences and our urges, if that makes sense. Um, and then, yeah, I guess like I kind of want to connect it again to the conversation about pain and suffering because I feel like the crux of what we were talking about is how pain and suffering can be perceived as distinct. And like what I was laying out, and I feel like this is not like unique to my perspective. I think also what you said about it, Hoda, in that conversation was very aligned. Is that like I would say like pain is a form of communication, and then
mm.
suffering is sort of like it tends to be like how we hold on to or process or bear that communication of pain without
Oof.
necessarily communicating. And I
Whoa.
think we can also communicate in ways which contribute to suffering, as I think you pointed out in your example of two people just sort of like ruminating on something, maybe like backing each other up, being like, oh, I don't know how that person could have done that to you. They must be like a so and so, whatever. Like that is a form of communication, but I wouldn't say that we're communicating in the same language in which pain communicates to us. I would say
Mm,
at that point we're sort of processing the communication of material reality and immaterial reality into what I would call astral material, which is like words and
mm,
concepts that very, very easily, I would say, in human bodies attach to pain and keep us in states of pain rather than releasing or responding to pain. And I feel like, a lot of teachers bring up the examples of, say, like cats or wild animals, which get hurt and then they just like shake it off and they move on. And I would say like some animals are a bit more like humans, where like that pain ends up imprinting their field so that they, um, perceive the onset of pain when it's not actually coming. Um, and perhaps like their actions are sort of weighed by the experience of pain. But I would say like many animals are very adept at just communicating with pain and then adjusting in ways that a lot of humans are not really primed to do nowadays. And for me, that extends all the way to like, what do we actually do about situations which, on some levels, perhaps on multiple levels, are causing us pain or causing other people pain, and sometimes, therefore, causing us pain if we're empathetic people,
Mm.
um, or if we're connected enough either to other humans and or to the body of Earth, such that we feel the pain of other people. So, to summarize, I would say that almost all of the behavioral patterns and thought form complexes, which consist what we tend to call culture, um, act as obstructions to communicating with pain, such that we can actually change our material realities, not so we can avoid pain, but so that we can live more joyfully. And I'm curious
Mm.
how that aligns with you or any of y'all.
Yeah, I'm gonna hold a little space because that transmission felt like a song to me. I appreciate you saying it. The crows also are going crazy where I am right now, and that they're cawing very loudly.
I guess another thing that comes up for me, and I feel like I might have learned about this through Mariam Hasna, who's not the most popular person in the room, I'll say, but I think that she talked about the distinction between rehearsing and releasing.
Mm.
And we were looking up the etymons of pain and suffering, and you know, basically pain was about um, like price or like blood money. Um, I would say etymologically about price, and suffering was about bearing or carrying. And I think that speaks to me to the difference between rehearsing something, even fermenting it and building it, practicing being good at suffering versus just releasing pain or releasing suffering so that we can experience pain and respond to it.
Mm.
And I feel like one of the questions I think Julie asked in the previous conversation is like, like if the state of things is so painful, like why do people feel stuck, or like why does it feel like action takes place at a glacial speed? And I feel like that's the main reason, right? It's because we're too busy, like not intentionally for the most part, but I would say that like we're highly enculturated to hold on to the things which stop us from moving or keep us moving in ways which exacerbate dynamics of pain instead of moving on.
And I feel like that enculturation sort of eclipses the possibility of developing a culture where like pain is part of our processing, and then like also the move towards like action that moves to either ameliorate the pain or um sort of change space so that like the pain isn't as directly influencing someone's ability to access their joy. And I think that, yeah, like those, to me, like that's kind of what the cosmic weather, or like when I do look at the cosmic weather, that is also what I'm looking for, like portals or opportunities where things, I mean, because if things happen for me personally and I'm like liberated and I'm like, I don't identify with my pain and I don't identify with my suffering, that's great for me. But if I'm in a culture where that's the norm, then it's like the onus for the that cultural shift to happen I won't say necessarily like falls on my shoulder, but I feel like, yeah, like at its base level, it's important for some of us, if we feel inspired to do that, to like model a reality that is not entrenched in suffering, and model a reality. This reality that's not entrenched in suffering can also possibly teach us how to not only be with pain, but to like invite. Because right now it feels like pain is like, if we were like in a village and like this was like a re-indigenized time period, like it feels like pain right now is like exiled from the community. And I'm like, okay, so like what kind of work and sort of steps would it take for us to invite pain back into the fold of the community? Like what kind of circle would we have to like exercise pain, right? If pain was like a person, to exercise pain of what it's experienced in its exile. And I think that metaphor is like really powerful for me, like because I'm like, we there's also stuff I feel like to disentangle or disenmesh, for lack of better words, from pain and what it's communicative, like what it is communicating as a receptor of reality. Like for me, um just like kind of like you alluded to, Nobu, like pain is communicating something. It is also a form of communication with our our earth consciousness and our consciousness within earth. And so that kind of like layered affect, I think, is also more of a drive, to me at least, to bring pain back into the fold, just as much as like love and ecstasy and intrigue and awe and curiosity are part of our human experience. I think also pain being part of that lineup builds a harmonic convergence, for lack of a better word, that speaks to the whole of human experience, as opposed to just continuously building these cultures that keep us separate from um, earth and human consciousness being in this almost like marriage, you know? Yeah, and we were talking about sex in this like tantra, and I'm like, wait, let me find out tantra is just a form of like re-indigenizing ourselves.
Yeah, so much I feel like that can be connected to what you were saying, but I loved the way you were characterizing pain as like an exiled member of the village. I feel like it touches upon some of the stuff that's been coming up around the topic of safety, but I'm not sure if I
Mhm.
want to go there yet. Um, I do want to give a shade to some of the things that people were saying in the chat, so it's not just you and I transmitting. And I mean, it's
Facts.
great.
Dismembering too,
um,
am I right?
Adam said, well, Adam said a couple of things. Well, Adam said, this is making me think about the importance of tapping into older memory within us instead of just getting the quote surface unquote of our lifetime in the last 100 years or so. Do you want to say more about that, Adam? Do you want to say a little bit about that, Adam? It's okay if you don't want to. And then Anna suggested the word metabolize for, I think, like releasing, which I actually really like a lot because I feel like it speaks to a more complex dynamic. And it's like, yeah, you can't, similar to what you were saying, Heather, about like, people will be like, oh, like, you know, the state, the material conditions you're in are just like a perspective. You just need to change your perspective. And it's like, no. I mean, like,
Yeah.
maybe like a billion or so people need to change their perspective and then everything will just flip, right? But I think like metabolization speaks to that process of like, I'll say like intra-body communication, which leads to the possibility of a release, right? It's not like I go to McDonald's. I don't know why I love McDonald's. I don't think they're ever going to sponsor the broom. But if I go to McDonald's and I eat a McChicken, it doesn't just like come straight out my asshole, right? Like there's a lot of metabolization there. So I really appreciate you putting that forward, Anna. Um, Adam also said, the role of constant entertainment is coming up for me regarding an unhealthy relationship or poor communication with pain, which I think is very important. Thanks, TikTok. Um, and then, yeah, I guess I wanted to touch back into, uh, yeah, like there was an episode of Archetypal Hour where we metabolized the archetype of the lovers in Taraki. Um, and I feel like there was a lot of like juicy gnosis which was shared there. But one of the things that was coming up, I think, was this idea of like sex as well, like sexual urges as perhaps being under the umbrella of urges which cause us to desire encounters with the unknown. And I loved kind of what was coming up in your transmission, Hoda, about the relationship between pleasure and pain as forms of communication. And like, dare I say, like, perhaps it's not completely unfair to generalize like the sexual urge as like something which causes us to like diverge from commonality and seek the unknown, and perhaps that pain is something that gives us reason to integrate what is outside so that it comes in. And of course, like, I feel like a relationship between pain and pleasure has been written about a lot, and a lot of people say that they're not necessarily essentially different, but show up as different communications within perspectives which are informed by karma. But I also feel like it would be somewhat an act of spiritual bypassing to pretend that those perspectives aren't firmly entrenched in our bodies.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, to, I guess, go deeper on what Adam was saying about reaching beneath the surface of the memories of our current lifetime in the past 100 years. I'm guessing he says, the phrase that came up is the quote, inertia of memory, unquote. But what if we could bring out deeper currents of intelligence below, which may resonate better with the emerging possibilities that want to come into form? I love that. What if? I think the world would be a more just and fair place. That's like a pretty deep question. I'm just answering it with like a pat, but that's honestly my answer. Lexi says, I also think about a spectrum of avoidance to over importance of pain, kind of often. Like those who can't feel it, and then also those who may act like it's a big deal or something, when really pain slash feeling pain is like a part of life and also for our own benefit too. Open parents, as a way to restore life, in my opinion, slash in my experience, close parents. Yes, that feels crystalline to me. Podrock says, I feel like giving honor and awareness to pain. I love the word honor. Oof, made me feel something. I feel like giving honor and awareness to pain instead of avoidance opens one up to deep growth opportunities and healing and can break repeating cycles of suffering.
Mhm.
Ashe. Period. Um, I want to point to, like, for me, the relationship between the word honor and honesty. Like, something that I think it was Bruce Lee said, he might have been quoting someone, is that, you know, expressing oneself honestly is very hard to do. And this was quoted on a song by an underground hip hop duo named Binary Star, who operate out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Some of their lyrics are a little bit spicy nowadays, but I'd say they were mostly tapping into some real truth. But yeah, to go back to what I think Bruce was saying, I don't think it's really possible to be honest with ourselves if we can't honor all of ourselves. And I would say that we tend to dishonor pain. We tend to leave it outside the village. Um, I guess like the topic of exile is pretty alive for me too. I mean, we've been talking about the Levant, and I feel like topics which are like adjacent to exile or not being allowed to be where perhaps the earth wants your body to be because of systemic repression, politics, geopolitics, theaters of war, etc. That's definitely alive for a lot of people, I would say, right now. But I would say that, like the broom, again, used to be called the breathing room. I would say that it was one of the nodes of communication which arose due to Twitter in a sort of ocean, which some people call teapot or this part of Twitter. And there's been stuff coming up over the past few weeks. I mean, I think there's been stuff coming up for a while, but particularly in the last few weeks, some things have been arising with regard to um, experiences of abuse, some of which, content warning, I believe is sexual in nature. And I feel like the topic of exile is like resonating with some of the reports that have been coming up, both in the way that it stops people from speaking out due to fear and also due to concern for those who might become accused of having caused experiences of abuse for other people. And I guess I feel like I'm probably going to talk about it carefully because I don't think that, as far as I can tell, I don't think that falsifiable accusations have been made, which I think is also I understand because I think it takes a long time for people to process experiences of abuse. And you might notice that I'm being very careful to say experiences of abuse because I think that what people are willing to call abuse changes a lot based on their experiences and the context in which they're communicating. So when I say experiences of abuse, I'm not saying abuse has occurred. I'm not saying abuse hasn't occurred. I'm saying that people, from what I've heard, have had experiences of abuse. Um, and yeah, I guess before I say any more, first I want to check that it's okay for y'all if I move on to this topic. And secondly, I'm curious if anything comes up with regard to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it feels fine for me to move on to this. And yeah, I feel informed. I'm holding space for others though to chime in.
I mean, like, it feels like a little bit of a leap from like Target and the Levant and mainstream media to stuff that's happening in, what a lot of people would call like a relatively small subset of the population, mostly, but, based in America mostly or in Western Europe. But I feel like it's also pertinent to speak to things that are happening within action of us as
Mm,
people. And I feel like we have the opportunity more readily at hand to ameliorate situations which happen, which arise due to our connections to parasocial media than we probably, most of us, I don't think anybody who listens to the Broom Radio is involved in the military industrial complex, for example. But yeah, I'd say that those opportunities are more readily at hand, closer to home, and that by exercising those opportunities and holding space for accountability and holding ourselves accountability for our actions in these places closer to home, we can actually learn things which empower us to act further from home. And I would also say that part of the suffering mechanisms that keep us locked into um, conflicts which happen pretty far away from our locus of action um, is to distract us from situations which arise and our ability to act upon situations which arise closer to our locus of action, or you could say within our matrices. This GIF is getting significant airtime in the room. um, I think it's Leonardo DiCaprio in like The Wolf of Wall Street or something, saying "Let's fucking go" and pounding his head with the microphone. It's some Leonardo DiCaprio film, and he's wearing a suit. Um, yeah, I guess like I want to be like really careful to talk about this because I think there are many ways in which people position themselves in talking about issues like this, which ultimately are, I would say, either consciously or subconsciously, or I should say, either intentionally or unconsciously self aggrandizing. And it's like really not my intention, or I would say, like my vibration or my movement. I would say to be self aggrandizing. But of course, please disagree, and I trust y'all to hold me accountable to that stated intention. And also let me know if either my intentions or the vibrations that lead me to move to make those intentions feel in any way misaligned for y'all. But, um, like we've been talking about safety and community and what those things mean for quite a while. I wouldn't say that we've spoken about them in completion because I don't feel like we've had the experiences that we need to be able to speak about them in completion. I also don't feel like we'll ever have enough experience in our lifetimes with regard to safety and establishing what community means in each context. But I kind of want to like connect it back to what Hoda was saying about exiling pain and exiling people and what safety tends to mean, or what people do in the name of quote safety unquote, versus what safety actually means to me in current time. And I would say that, please interrupt me. And then I'll also say that I'll say, like, when we think about what people do to establish or enforce safety, it mostly involves maybe not exiling people, but definitely like separating behaviors and separating people based on, heuristics which lead us to label behaviors and people as safe or unsafe. But please disagree. So we can talk about like licensing of alcohol, tobacco. We can talk about violence. We can talk about labeling people as unsafe if it seems as if they have what we might call problematic relationships with controlled substances, or problematic relationships with those behaviors, which again I would call demons. um, yeah, Hoda says the heuristics of safe and unsafe feels very alive to me. And I think like something we've talked about in previous episodes of Roundup, or maybe in Why Am I Like This? We did an episode on safety. Um, like one of the things I said, which feels really spicy to me and perhaps not completely justifiable, is that whenever we cause ruptures in community, we increase the availability of that which makes us unsafe. And I guess I'll justify it a little bit more by saying that when people feel disconnected from one another, it's rupturous and it's traumatizing, and that behavioral programs or patterns and thought form complexes tend to attach to disorganized energy, which is often disorganized via rupture and disconnection. So we can also talk about imprisonment, or what most nation states or governments or law enforcement officials might euphemistically refer to as rehabilitation, can also include perhaps institutions of secular psychotherapy within that privileged circle. Um, what's another word that people use for like jail? Re Rehabilitation, re something. I don't know. I think it's all euphemistic. I don't think that a lot of like repair happens in those institutions. I feel like a lot of money continues to flow in the directions it's used to flowing as a result of those institutions and law enforcement. Um, I said it's all performative, and I'm like, who actually likes this performance? Like, is anybody enjoying this TV show? I feel like we talk a little bit about this a lot. In the broom, I'd like to talk a lot about it, a lot in the broom and outside the broom. What it says L is, that's for sure. Yeah, L's just like eating TV dinners, consuming this drama porn a lot of the time, I would say. Um, but yeah, I guess like the reason I'm talking about like safety as something which I would say is downstream of rupture is because I feel like it's probably really unclear like what the some people in the broom are trying to do with this lineage space that we've been calling safety or pound safety or hash safety. But I feel like it's really important to say that like integrity on individual and social slash collective levels and integration within individuals and within social bodies and community bodies and collective bodies is about as close to a primary directive as I feel called to name. And I don't think that it's integrative to hear some things about some people and conclude that those people need to be exiled. I don't think it's integrative to hear what some other people say about some other people in a community and choose to exile those people. And I think that integration can occur in many different ways. I would say that integration can only occur through integrity. And I feel like that means that it's paramount that people who work conscientiously on their own integration and integrity involve themselves in matters of disintegration on social and collective and individual levels. Um, I think like to translate that into like more lay speak is I'd say that if you're trying to help people heal, you should concentrate on your own healing. And if you're trying to help social bodies or human societies heal, you should concentrate on your own healing. And if you're trying to ... you should concentrate on your own healing. Um, so yeah, please cut me off. I guess I'm curious if I know some people are typing right now, but I guess I'm curious if anything feels like it's coming through anybody's integrated integrated vessel on anything that I've said or anything that I'm speaking to right now. And I would say, like, for me, it's not of integrity to speak with much more specificity about the people or the alleged events right now. And I wouldn't say that it feels like it's because of fear, but I feel like it would be disintegrative to do so without, I would say, like, falsifiable accounts having been publicized about what's been going on. And I would say that for me, it comes from integrity to, yeah, it's a bit of a cliche, but to try and see the people who are involved as their vaster selves and also their smaller selves, as in like their inner children, and navigate any of this, all of it, whatever I feel called to navigate with grace and discernment. And I pray that other people feel the same way. Also pray that if there's information which I haven't been privy to, that um, people trust that they can share it with me or publicize it and then share it with me, or just publicize it or share it with somebody who they feel has the integrity and the capacity to hold it. And yeah, I would say that for me, the events that people have spoken to can still be transmuted or metabolized through integrated communication such that the outcomes are integrative for the social body that we sometimes call teapot. And also, since I'm sure some people are like, oh, like, why should we like give any awareness to this like internet drama? I would say that without objectifying it as like a critical object or like a teaching object, I would say that many of us have the opportunity to ameliorate this collective body by giving integrated awareness to what's happening and also learn how to behave in integrative ways more and less locally as a result of it. Or we can just make popcorn and chew loudly and throw it at the screen as well as the other viewers. But that doesn't feel very integrative to me. Hoda says, yes, it's a learning opportunity to me. I would say as I navigate these ways, it's also an integration opportunity for me because stuff comes up, right? And I have to
Yeah.
like pay attention to what's happening in my field and see what's ready to be released in order to discern whether or how to receive it.
Right.
Mm. I mean, so I'm kind of feeling like a little bit of a pull away from the topic. Um, I'm a little, I would say I'm clearing um, reservations I have about having spoken so much about it without other people speaking on it. But um, I definitely want to give some shade to stuff that's happening inside the broom. um, I know that later today we, of course, have a group exorcism container called Tea that many of us often make offerings to. Um, there is a live energy working demonstration between one of the members of the broom and the 000 lineage space named Lena R. I feel like that person is pretty public about their full name, but I don't feel confident in that right now, so I'm just going to say Lena R. And Hoda, who will be working on me next week, will be receiving energy work from Lena R. And that's a container called Dojo. And there's like a buttload of containers coming up. There's the Sharia Way read along, and I believe we'll be reading chapters 7 and 8 of Hazrat Inayat Khan's Mysticism of Sound and Music.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Hmm.
And I really much look forward to digesting or metabolizing that with y'all on Saturday, I believe, although that might change, I'm not sure. And I think also there'll be a second episode of The Keeper of All's Culture Hour container on a culture which I believe is pronounced Luo, which comes from Kenya. And I feel like there are many magical traditions and wisdom traditions there which are very ripe for being discussed amongst unfamiliar circles. And then, yeah, I guess I'll leave it there in terms of like previewing upcoming events so I'm not just reading out prognostications of time, and I'll say that around a week ago, we purchased the domain for the broom, and it's called thebroom.us, as in US. And I feel like all of us have been sort of like meditating and percolating on like what that might look like. And I'm very excited to share more with y'all. Does anybody else have anything they want to talk about in this week's roundup before I relieve Craig of his duties? Hodo is like a synchronicity factory, and apparently there was a truck next to Hodo which said Fidelity: safety team. Mm, if y'all aren't familiar with Fidelity, I would say it's like a investment bank with a very cool name. Um, but yeah, if y'all feeling pretty complete, I'm just gonna let Craig know he can stop recording. Um, Love to see you in the broom. Love to see you discussing some of the things we've talked about, which are sort of broom related and sort of not related. And look forward to seeing y'all in any of our live containers soon. Peace.